Now that we've looked at demand, our next two lecture segments will talk about supply, or the behavior of sellers. So when we look at supply, we're going to start with the same kind of distinction we looked at on the demand side of the market, this distinction between quantity supplied and supply itself, which is a lot like the distinction between quantity demanded and demand. So when we talk about quantity supplied describes the quantity that sellers will offer for sale, how much they would like to sell, given the price and given all other factors that affect their decisions over some time period. So we can define this either at the firm level, given the price of the product and all of these other factors, how much does a specific firm choose to offer for sale? Or if we add those firm quantities supplied together at a given price, that gives us the market level quantity supplied. So when I just say quantity supplied, we're going to presume that we're talking about the market level rather than the firm level. So we're describing a specific quantity that firms offer for sale at a specific price. When we talk about supply itself, that describes this relationship between the price and the quantity supplied over some time period, holding all other factors constant. Anything else that might affect supplier decisions, those things are not changing. So here we have a set of the quantity supplied at each different price that might exist. So I need to digress a little bit and talk about profit. So we're learning about how firms make decisions based on market incentives. So we're looking at prices being the main market incentives here, and profits being another type of market incentive. So when we talk about profit, that's the firm's net revenue, or their total revenue minus their total costs. So we take the revenue they get from selling their product, and then they have to pay for all of their expenses. If there's something left over, we have profit that's positive. If the costs exceed their overall revenue, then the firm suffers a loss, so the profit would be negative. So we're going to presume for now that the purpose of the firm is to earn profits that flow to the owners of the firm. So total revenue, another way we could write that, is the price of the product times the quantity. If you sell 10 units at a price of $5 each, you'll have $50 of revenue. Total costs we're going to write as the quantity times the average cost. So the AC there stands for average cost, or simply cost per unit. So the cost per unit times the number of units gives us the overall total cost that the firm incurs. And so we can write profit as price times quantity, which is our total revenue, minus the quantity times average cost, which is our total cost. And so now I can combine this a little bit differently and write profit as being the quantity times the difference between price and average cost. So price minus average cost, the price is how much revenue each firm generates. Average cost is the cost per unit. So if this is positive, that means that we have a positive profit per unit times the number of units gives us the firm's overall profits. But if the price is less than the cost per unit or less than the average cost, this is going to be negative, and we multiply that by the quantity, we're going to have negative overall profits. So if the price of the product goes up, this difference is going to get larger. So if the price is rising, these profits per unit are getting bigger. But if the price is decreasing, these profits per unit are getting smaller. So the law of supply summarizes this relationship between price and quantity supply and tells us that price and quantity supplied are positive related, or that they tend to move in the same direction. So if the price of the product goes up, recall that that means that we have higher profits per unit. Firms respond to that by increasing the quantity supplied. They want to sell more units because they're getting more profit from each unit that they sell. But if the price goes down, quantity supplied would be expected to decrease. At a lower price, the profits per unit are smaller, and so the firm gets less benefit from each unit that they sell, so they're not willing to sell as many units. And again, we're assuming that all other factors that affect the supplier decisions are remaining constant. We'll look at those factors changing and the resulting shifts in supply in our next lecture. So is this always true? This one seems a little less transparent than when we talked about law of demand. And part of that is because when we look at seller behavior, we often don't really have perfectly competitive markets. So remember, we're talking about the behavior of perfectly competitive firms which might not quite fit reality. If we want to talk about realistic markets, we need to adjust our model a little bit. And unfortunately, we don't really get to those more realistic markets till the last week of this course. So in any case, is it always true? Well, it is true if we actually have perfectly competitive firms. But we also see situations where this doesn't appear to be true, and that's usually because our firms are not perfectly competitive or that they're using some kind of strategic behavior. So, for example, around Thanksgiving time, I'll see that the grocery stores mark down the price of turkeys almost below cost, or perhaps they are below cost. Well, they're marking the prices down, and they're offering a bigger quantity than they normally do. Well, the reason for that is that's a loss leader. They're trying to get people into their store, and so if we buy these cheap turkeys, we're also going to buy all the stuffing and the mashed potatoes and the things that go with the turkey. And that's a strategic move. If we really have perfectly competitive firms, the law of supply should hold true, unless they simply don't have enough time to respond. And we'll talk about that in our elasticity chapter. So we can organize our supply information using a schedule. So at a price of 50 cents, perhaps we see a quantity supplied of 20. At a price of $1.50, we see a higher quantity supply of 60, etc., etc. And we can organize this graphically. So again, we have the quantity on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. And we have all of these points plotted out. So price of $2, quantity supply of 80. Price of $2, quantity supplied of 80. The line here showing supply is representing all the points described within our table. So reading supply, if we start with a specific price, then we go horizontally to the supply curve to find the maximum quantity that firms would be willing to offer for sale at that price, or the quantity supplied that would exist at that price. The vertical read, if we start with a specific quantity and then go up to where we are on the supply curve, that shows us the lowest price that could be charged in order for firms to be willing to offer that quantity for sale. So when we look at changes in the price of the product, everything else held constant, that causes us to move to a new row in our supply schedule. But note that the supply schedule has not changed. So we would say that our quantity supplied has changed because of the price change, but supply itself is the same as before. A change in the price, everything else held constant, also causes us to move along the supply curve to a new point on that same supply curve. So again, we would say that quantity supplied has changed, but supply itself has not. So note that the supply curve hasn't changed, simply where we are along the supply curve has changed. So our big important idea, when we have price changes, those don't change supply and they do not shift supply curves because the concept of supply already tells us the quantity supplied at various prices. So when the price changes, we simply move along the supply curve rather than shifting it. So that wraps up our introduction to supply. The next lecture is going to focus on these other factors changing and how that causes shifts in supply.